if this is your first session to the Big Bold Jewish Climate Fest. There are over 160 sessions, which I find somewhat incredible and a little bit baffling, going on between Wednesday and Sunday, and I think one straggling one on Monday even. So please continue to show up, and I am really excited to spend the evening with you. Tu B'Shvat Sameach, this evening marks the beginning of the holiday of Tu B'Shvat. So for those who don't know me, I am a rabbi, I'm a mother, I'm a writer, and I have a passion for liturgy and a passion for trees. And this is one exploration of why I have a passion for trees. I come to climate activism and to life in general with this persistent question of what spiritual ground do we stand on as we are facing this crisis. I'm gonna ask everyone to please mute yourselves. Thank you. And the presentation that I'm gonna offer you is one of the, I would not want to use the word answer, but one of the companion clusters of thought and images that are accompanying me on my quest to find some kind of spiritual ground from which to live a life of meaning in the midst of the ecological crisis and all of the upheaval that we face. It is certainly not my only answer, but it is one, and I'm excited to share it with you. So I'm going to share screen, and somebody's going to be able to tell me how do I put this in presentation mode? Just unmute yourself and tell me if you can. Anybody? PowerPoint, anyone? All right.
Hit the button that says play from start.
Play from start, great, thank you. And then I'll be able to control it. Amazing, thank you. Okay, so this is gonna be a somewhat frontal shiur, as we say in Hebrew, a sort of frontal lesson, as you were, but my hope is that by scheduling it for 1 hour and 15 minutes, we'll have some time for comments and questions. And if you have comments and questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat. I'm probably not going to take them as we go, but I will do my best to leave time at the end. This is not normally how I teach, so I'm excited to try it out. So I've always loved studying history. I double majored in it with environmental studies, and I think that it comes ultimately from a deep desire in my own soul to get oriented. Here we are on this planet, where did we come from? What has happened before? And I've always found the global industrial technological context within which I was born to be a bit baffling and certainly unsettling to my nervous system. And I have been seeking for some kind of grounding in something that feels more authentic, more native to my soul. So when I was a child growing up in New England, where I still live, we would visit the homes of the transcendentalists, such as Emerson, picture of whose house we see on the left. And that felt very old. The 19th century felt very old, and I loved grounding in Concord and in the home of the transcendentalists. My family and I took a trip to Europe when I was in my early teens, visiting the castles there from the 14th century. The 13th century felt very old. That's the center slide. On the right, pictures from the ancient land of Israel. The ruins there, more on the lines of 2,000 years old, maybe a little bit more. Okay, we're getting deeper. This is starting to orient me in time a little bit. And then last year, I read a science magazine about the evolution of the genus Homo, of which our species is but one. And in that story, 1 million years is old, so that's right up here. And 5 million, 4 or 5 million is really old in the story of our genus. That's about when we probably split off from the common ancestor we share with chimps. So when we talk about our human history, that is where we start to look at meaningful evolution. Then I started to get more interested in evolutionary biology in general, not just as a hobby, but as a kind of quest for spiritual resilience in this age of evolutionary upheaval, geologic upheaval. And it turns out that plants are a lot older. And I'm a visual learner. So in this quest for understanding a different sort of text, if you will, as a rabbi, I spent a lot of time looking at the written sources, ancient sources, right, from a human standpoint, 2,000 years old, even 1,000 years old, feels very, very old. But I started to hunger for even older text and wanting to look to the green world for some of that. So I looked for a visual that might help, and I came across these two posters, which are in my home. On the left is a poster of Evolutionary Life. It's hard to see because we're on PowerPoint, but way down at the bottom is the very first life on the planet. The beginning of what's visually depicted as a tree. And as the tree goes up, the branches show the different branching off, and each group of organisms is depicted when that group first evolved. And this gave me a whole other sense of old. And I in particular started to get really interested in around 360 million years ago, which makes a million years or 2,000 years seem like, less than a blink of an eye. So 360 million years is right, if you can, do you see my mouse when I'm screen sharing? Is the second big thick gray line up from the bottom is about 360 million years ago. And that's a really interesting time. That's when we start to get the first seed bearing plants. So before that, the mosses and ferns, we have spores, and spores can't reproduce outside of water. So life can't get too far from the water's edge. But 360 million years ago, all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but evolutionarily all of a sudden, there are seed-bearing plants. It is also, just for context, 100 million years before the first dinosaurs. And my other favorite thing about 360 million years ago, which completely blows my mind every single time I think about it, is that the last common ancestor of a pine tree and a maple tree is 360 million years ago. The last common ancestor of the gymnosperms, which are the seed-bearing plants who don't make flowers. So most of what we think of as conifers, most but not all of what we think of as evergreens. And all of the broadleaf trees who make flowers, and all of the plants who make flowers, their last common ancestor is 360 million years ago, which means, as we are here on Tu B'Shvat and thinking about the trees and the meaning of trees, that to become a tree is something that happens on planet Earth a whole lot. Trees are an example of convergent evolution, meaning that they have independently evolved many, many, many times. Every family of modern trees traces back to an ancestor who was not a tree. So that amazes me. It means that every time we're looking at communities of trees, we're looking not at actually necessarily close relatives. Some of them are closely related, but we're looking at a way of being, a way of drawing nutrients from the sun, from the soil, having xylem and phloem up and down the trunks, storing nutrients in the roots, hibernating it, not exactly the right word, but for the winter, sending sugar up. This is something that has independently evolved multiple times, many, many, many times over the course of the life on Earth. And that amazes me, and I love it. I just absolutely love it. So from this poster, oh, and on the right, I should just mention, it's also a fun poster. It's not to scale, so it's better if you're just interested in the various geological eras and what was happening in the ocean and on land in terms of life in each one. So I have them kind of back to back, so I can take the frame off the wall and see the one on the right, and generally I have the one on the left up. So enter COVID, and I played Chazan, the cantor role at a High Holiday Services at a congregation in Maine. And instead of going in person, I was Zooming. And Erev Rosh Hashanah happened. I'm not a congregational rabbi anymore, so I had not yet led services on Zoom during the pandemic. And right away, the most immediate problem was that I was davening, I was praying, looking at my own image on a screen. That did not work for me. It was very distracting, and it did not at all feel like my prayers were being part of a collective going out into the universe or to God, however we want to describe that. And so Rosh Hashanah morning, I hastily created a focal point for my davening, a focal point for me to visually, again, I'm very visual, to look at when I wasn't looking at the machzor, when I wasn't looking at the prayer book. And what I set up, you'll see on the left, is a kind of altar, a kind of Aron Kodesh, like a kind of holy ark. Instead of a Torah, I had my little paper cut that my folks gave me for my bat mitzvah that says, Eitz Chaim hi lamachazikim ba, that the Torah is a tree of life and depicts a tree. I had that Tree of Evolutionary Life, a history of existing life that I just showed you in the previous slide. And I had my husband's and my shiviti, which is a form of art in Jewish tradition that uses the Hebrew letters and God's name to be a focal point, sort of like a mandala might be. So those became my focal point for davening. And what happened there was very interesting and totally unintentional, which is that the images started to overlap and intertwine with my understanding of the liturgy for the high holidays. So on the one hand, I had just the image of a tree, just an actual tree. On the other, I had the metaphor of Torah as tree. I had the evolutionary tree of life, as we can picture, again, a metaphor, but not a terrible one at all, of the root and the trunks and the branches splitting off of the divergence of the incredible variety of life on planet Earth. And I had the name of God, Shem Hashem, Yod He Vav He, which translates essentially as an improbable and impossible conjugation of the verb to be, is, was, and will be, kind of smooshed together in 4 Hebrew letters, which the mystics, myself included, like to think of as Yod He Vav He Adonai is one name for all of existence and that which makes existence possible. So, as I was holding this in my mind, davening, the interesting thing that began to happen is I started to feel much more in touch with what I would call a universal, or perhaps Gaian, from the term Gaia, the name for the living earth, flavor of God, God field, if you will, than I usually do in a synagogue. So in a synagogue, when I'm leading prayer, there's a Torah in front of me, usually, or there's people, we have the symbols of Judaism all around us. And I feel very connected to the God of Israel, to the images and body associations that I feel when I feel into my Judaism, which are powerful and large. But when I was davening for the high holidays with this in front of me, I started to feel much more connected to the living earth as the image of God. And that is pretty normal for me. That's actually one of my go-to places to feel connected to God, but I had not up until this point felt that connection to that kind of flavor of God. I had not yet felt that while I was davening, right? So that's the difference, is that I started to feel a connection to the universal and to the earth-based in the middle of my davening. And I started to read the High Holiday Liturgy in quite a different way. So I just want to start with this beautiful image, or not to start, to continue with this beautiful image from the Over story, which those who know me know I take as sacred text at this point. So the professor, don't worry about the storyline, the professor describes an explosion of living forms, 100 million new stems and twigs from the prodigious trunk. So we're talking here about that tree that I showed you, the image of the tree. She talks about Tane Mahuta, Igratsil, Janmu, the tree of good and evil, the indestructible Asvata with roots above and branches below. Then the professor is back at the original world tree, this tree of evolution. 5 times at least, she says, the tree has been dropped. And 5 times it has resprouted from the stump. Now it's toppling again, and what will happen this time is anybody's guess. That's forming the background as I go into the High Holiday Liturgy. I just want to take a sec because I don't have a co-host to just double check that nobody is waiting on Zoom. Oops, okay. My poor son is not yet asleep and has been, because of the pandemic, only used to me doing bedtime. So that is very sad and sort of in the background. So what I have up here are some of the central prayers of the High Holiday Liturgy. And I apologize that this is all in Hebrew. This is the machzor that I use. So, Unetaneh Tokef Shirat HaYam. Let's proclaim the holiness of this day, and not just on Rosh Hashanah. So here's what started to happen. I have these images of the world tree, of God as tree, of Torah as tree, and of the evolutionary tree of life. And I'm reading this liturgy, and oh my God, it starts to mean all this new stuff. Let's proclaim the power of this day. All of a sudden, it's not just this day of Rosh Hashanah, it's this era that we are in right now. This is a time of mass extinction. It's a time when lives are held in the balance, not just the high holidays, but this geological day that we are in. And all of the species are going before God. Right, so we can hear it in the Hebrew. ומעביר צאנו תחת שבטו, כן תעביר ותספוד ותמנה ותפקוד נפש כל חי. ותחתוך קצפה לכל בריאה ותכתוב את גזר דינם. All of the individual souls is how this is usually referred to, but I'm hearing it as all the species are passing before the Holy One of Blessing, before before the force of being itself, and are going through this gauntlet of who shall live and who shall die. And of course, once we put that lens on, at least for me, it was practically impossible to take it off. So now we have the famous liturgy, who by fire, who by water, who by famine, who by thirst. And it's like, it's really almost too close to home. It's very painful, but very powerful. And we come to the end of that, and we got that powerful piece of wisdom. Uteshuva, utefila, utzedaka, mavirin et ro'ah hagezera. That returning to balance, prayer, and tzedakah, righteous living and righteous giving, can help mitigate, take away some of the badness of the decree. So I don't know quite how to read that in terms of other species, but I know that for humans, this is very true, that when we are faced with any kind of major threat, including an existential one, especially an existential one, whether to our own souls or to a loved one, that doing the inner work to come in balance to ourselves and to express ourselves, which I think is the most expansive definition of tefillah, which in Hebrew means prayer, but has this sense of back and forthness of mutual communication and self-expression in the Hebrew root. And when we are engaged in living not just for ourselves, but for others, those actions help us to sustain ourselves in times of threat. And we get to the next piece here after the Tshuva Tefillah Tzedakah. Adam Yisodome Afar Visofo Afar. Humanity, your end is your foundation is dust, and your end is dust. Again, usually we hear this in terms of the individual, which is totally true. But let's start to hear it on a species level also. We are part of a branch of a giant tree who has been here billions of years before us, and God willing will go on billions of years after us. And there is such humility and power to be had in giving ourselves, not fatalistically, I'm not saying to give in at all to the fight, but on a spiritual level to remember that this whole life force thing is so much bigger. It's so much bigger than we are. Again, once we put on this frame of, okay, we're not just talking about individuals, and we're not just talking about Jews, and we're not just talking about humans, we're talking about all of life when we're in the high holidays, then other pieces of the liturgy start to be really interesting and powerful as well. So Ledor Vador starts to mean a whole new thing. Ledor Vador means from generation to generation. Again, usually we're thinking about it in terms of Jewish continuity, in terms of having come from a past of ancestors and going forward. We can, I think Psalm 145 in its original is talking not just about Jewish or Israelite tribal continuity, but human continuity in general. But I want to say that we can now open this up, that Ledor Vador does not just mean human, that it actually has to do, can also have to do with the generations of life that come on an evolutionary scale. Ledor Vador nagid godlecha. Every generation, every mutation that has spawned forth new species has been another way of praising your name, praising the name of existence, praising the name of God. And we're part of that process, even though, as I'll get to, we've sort of taken ourselves to a funny route as humans. And Kol Anshama Hallelujah, of course, that all breathing souls praise God, no matter what happens to humanity. And I'm not saying this is so comforting to most parts of our brains, and certainly not to our bodies, but for me anyway, on a soul level, I find it incredibly comforting to know that this project of responding to the gift of life goes on beyond our individual lives and beyond humanity, if it comes to that. So I want to take us to, just check on the time. Great. So I want to take us to a text. Of hopefully a familiar text. Oops. So Genesis chapter 2, and forgive me, for the sake of time, I'm just going to read it, even though I'm sure a diversity of voices would be good, but I'm just going to take us through. So God planted a garden in Eden in the east and placed there the human whom God had formed. This is straight from Genesis 2 in the Torah. From the ground that God caused to grow every tree that was pleasing to sight and good for food, with the tree of life, Eitz HaChaim, in the middle of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and bad. So let's see a midrash, a rabbinic take on this text. God made to grow from the earth all of these plants, including the tree of life. Oops, sorry. And the rabbis ask, what is meant here by the tree of life? If we're talking about an actual tree that actually grew, what are we talking about? Bereshit Rabbah says, the tree of life here means that the tree spread out her branches. I'm putting in the gender there. I like to give personal pronouns to living beings, including plants. So spread her branches over the face of all living beings. They're picturing, the rabbinic imagination is incredible. It's somewhat psychedelic. So they're picturing an actual tree planted in the ground, but whose branches spread over everything. Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eli says, the tree of life traversed an area that's covered by 500 years worth of travel time. And all the waters of creation branched out from under the tree. So first of all, I love that, like, long before anyone was thinking about space travel, the rabbis, and I think many in the ancient world, right? You think, okay, it's a day's walk. That's how we measure time. It's a day's walk, it's 3 days walk. Well, this is 500 years worth of walking in order to cover all of the area underneath the trunk and all of the, underneath the branches, and all the waters of creation come out from under this tree. So the tree becomes not just, not a normal tree that would suck water up, but a tree that actually gives forth life-giving waters. Rabbi Yudan, in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eli, adds, not only do the tree's boughs spread over 500 years journey in diameter, and I don't quite understand how the math here works. I couldn't figure out how to draw it, but her trunk requires 500 years to walk around. That's a really big tree. So I love this image. I love this image of the tree of life, and I love that that the rabbis were kind of like how I'm going in my imagination, picturing like the evolutionary tree. It's so much bigger than us. It's so vast. This is not some like magical tiny thing in a garden. This is something that is as big as life with a capital L itself. So now we get to another piece of text that I want to bring in from later in the story. So, and I'm experimenting with gender neutral pronouns. So God took the human who is not gendered yet and placed here in the Garden of Eden to till it and tend it. God commanded the humans, saying, of every tree of the garden you're free to eat. But as for the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you must not eat of it. For as soon as you eat of it, you shall die. I should say this is said to Adam, who is understood to be male, but I still kind of like the gender bending in these early stories. So now we have the picture of a tree of life. And now we have this other tree that we're going to hone in on that I think is important to us understanding mythologically, at least, what's happening to us as a species now. If you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you're going to die. But let's remember that that's not actually what happens, right? They do eat from that tree and they don't die. At least they don't die right then. They do become mortal. So Ramban, Nachmanides, says, it seems that right in my eyes that before eating the tree of knowledge, the human did what came naturally, stayed within instinct, right? Just as the heavens and all their hosts, which only do truth, whose acts are only truth, just as all these angels don't deviate from their appointed task, there's no love in their actions or hate, which I think is really interesting. Ramban sees here like instincts, it's just neutral. You're just doing what is programmed. The fruit of this tree gives birth to the will and desire that those who eat it should choose a thing or its opposite. All of a sudden we have free choice. And that is why it is called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of the knowledge, da'at tovara. Da'at in our language in Hebrew refers to will or intention. After they ate from the tree, they had this choice. They had this extra element of control, and they had the will to do evil to themselves or to others. So that in and of itself, I don't know will be news to us, but I want to read it a little bit through this lens. Again, thinking about this on a species level. What does it mean to eat from the tree of knowledge? And what is this myth? Let me just see what I have in my next slide. Okay, not quite yet. So I'll take off screen share while I'm saying the next piece. Oops. Okay. So I want to first say, because I have a point I want to make, but I want to preface it with a little bit of context and acknowledgement. I am on Wampanoag land. The peoples who lived here were living here sustainably, well, peoples on this continent anyway, right, for 11 to 14,000 years. And many indigenous people throughout history and on many continents have dwelled in sustainable ways, or at least have found a homeostasis of sustainability, even if perhaps the first time humans got to that land, there were massive changes that happened. So I want to acknowledge that for sure, and the wisdom in indigenous culture. And it is to them that we need to be looking for the models that we need as a whole species. Robin Wall Kimmerer, whom I love, a botanist, and whom I'll quote from a little bit later, says, we are longing for a day where the land will again say thank you for its people, or the land will again say thank you for its people. So I want to say, like, I think that's possible. And now I want to say something else. On an evolutionary level, humans are native to Africa. Not making political claims like I think this land is native land and it was colonized. I'm not making the claim that it does not, that justice is not owed. But from a biological level, on the scale of evolution, we were native to Africa. And that is why the large mammals, the megafauna are still there and aren't elsewhere. At least that is the general consensus about why they're there, which is to say that giraffes and elephants evolved along with Homo sapiens. So as we got smarter, they got smarter. They were able to have some time on the scale of tens of thousands of years to make adaptation to how smart we were getting. But we got real smart. Our brains got real big. We started eating food that was cooked and we got to travel. And all of a sudden we picked up speed and we began to be able to change through what's called cultural evolution and not just biological evolution. Biological evolution happens by chance, as we know. Mutation happens, species change, but you have to wait for the mutation to happen and and that the speed of reproduction for the change to be made. But with humans, we can go to a new environment and with our big old brains, figure out how to live there in the span of a generation. The prey animals whom we're hunting, the plants that we're cutting down, they don't have that kind of time to adapt to us. So I want to suggest, this is metaphor, take it if it's useful to you. I find it really compelling that leaving Africa was the first, and I use that metaphor, not actually totally metaphor, leaving the part of Africa where we were native, where we were indigenous, where our evolution kept a pace with the animals and plants and ecosystems there. Once we left as a species, that was like an eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And now we had power over the ecosystems where we were, because we were evolving at a different pace than they could keep up with. And in this, like, I don't know what an evolutionary scientist would say about this, but in my own current, like, seeking to understand these things, I've gotten excited about, maybe excited's the wrong word. I'm intrigued by thinking about sort of three main moments where humanity ate from the tree of knowledge and further separated ourselves from the rest of the tree of life, where we ate from the tree of knowledge and further separated ourselves from all these other species on that poster I showed you. Not that we are fundamentally different, because I really don't believe that. Not that we're the only ones with intelligence, because I surely think that there's multiple and incredible intelligence on Gaia, on the earth, but that we are able to adapt and make an impact in the places where we live at a pace where other creatures and ecosystems have no chance, because they don't evolve through culture. At least most of them don't. They evolve through mutation. So what I'm playing around with is that about 100,000 years ago, right, blink of an eye in terms of evolution, we got into Eurasia, and that was like a species moment of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. About 90,000 years after that, we have gone all over the globe. I'm pretty sure not yet some of Polynesia, but most of the globe. And agriculture emerges. And I would say that that is another huge bite out of that tree of knowledge, because now not only do we have the ability to outcompete any other predators or prey animals as soon as we set our mind to it and our technology to it. But now we are producing enough food that we can just keep making more of us, and then we need more food in order to keep making more, in order to feed the ones we have. And we get caught in this cycle of agriculture, which the existential angst of which I'm sure people have written tomes about, and I don't have time to get into now. And of course, there were civilizational collapses. If you've read Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, there are some there that were pre-industrial, where native peoples, or people who were the first humans to arrive at a place, Easter Island's probably one of the most famous examples, did not live sustainably and used up the, I don't even like the word used up, but essentially did what happens to apex predators when they eat all of their prey, which is the population collapses. And there is there's a kind of anger that I hear from some from deep ecologists perhaps, when we look at the text of the Torah, saying, "Oi, like, why would we? How awful that we have this myth that shows humans as above nature, and that talks about dominion over the earth, and like that's not the myth we want." And to that, I want to say, I wonder if this isn't. Wonder what happens if we think about this myth not as prescriptive, meaning that it's not what the people whose subconscious first wrote it down or first started talking about it. It's not necessarily what they wished would be the case. I want to suggest it's just what they saw was the case, that this came out of an agricultural society where the role that humans were already playing was so out of, was one of dominion and not of the kind of mutuality that can come from some of the other cultures around the world where we see attending to the natural, to the ecosystems around us. And that isn't, I mean, some of those cultures also had agriculture, so I think there's multiple ways of doing it. But I think myth does not necessarily have to be heard as prescriptive. I think it's often just saying what the culture sees to be true. And when we think about exile as a dominant concept in Jewish spirituality, that we were exiled from the land, but that parallels an exospiritual exile, that the Shekhinah and the Holy Blessed One, that they are these two parts of the Godhead, if you will, that long to come together. For me, personally, in my spiritual life, I understand that viscerally because I have forever, since I can remember, longed to come back to what I might call the instincts of Eden, or one better, maybe not all the way back to instinct, but to having human intellect while being able to live well on the earth and as part of a system where the land would actually give thanks for my being on her, instead of me being one of millions and millions of people stuck in an extractive system that's hurting her. And that to me is the fundamental exile that we're all stuck in, and that climate action and spiritual work and the recompanioning, I don't know if I've just made up that word, of life in America is working towards. That when we distance ourselves from so deeply from land, which the vast majority of us are, no matter how much time we spend outside, that we also distance ourselves from each other and from our animal, our deepest needs as part of the genus Homo, as great apes. So like Torah and like our liturgy, I personally, I know this is not for everyone, find great solace in the long game. I'll say I have a bizarre phobia of looking underwater at depth. So I can like do swimming pools and lakes, but I really cannot look at even a picture of a deep ocean scene without closing my eyes involuntarily. And I imagine that there are those for whom deep time, which is kind of the loving nickname for this sort of thinking, evokes a similar sense of fear. Like it's vertiginous to think about this amount of time and to think about how small we are in relationship to it. So if it's not your jam and you're like, that's the rest, that is all I need, there are totally other ways of exploring spiritual resilience in a time of climate change. This is but one of many. I'm just going to go back to a screen share and close this part of a presentation with a couple of quotes. Oh, and we'll have plenty of time to talk. Oops, screen share. Share screen. Okay. Sorry, these are not fabulously legible, but I wanted the old growth forest in the background. So three of my teachers, not that I know them personally, but three of the people whose writings I look to, I wanted to pull from their wisdom. Richard Powers, who wrote the Overstory, Robin Wall Kimmerer is an indigenous Potawatomi Nation member and botanist who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass and Gathering Moss, and Joanna Macy, whom I'm sure many of you have done work around her. She does the work that reconnects, and oh look, my husband has one of her books right on his desk that I'm using. So I just wanted to end with three quotes from them. On the left, Robin Wall Kimmerer says, "We need acts of restoration, not only for polluted waters and degraded lands, but also for our relationship to the world. We need to restore honor to the way we live, so that when we walk through the world, we don't have to avert our eyes with shame, so that we can hold our head up high and receive the respectful acknowledgement of the rest of the earth's beings." And to me, using the language of the presentation that I put forth, to me, what that means is we've eaten from the tree of knowledge. We can't go back. That's not the path for our species. And I don't think that's what the earth would want anyway. I think she has an incredible amount of fun getting to interact with us and all of our creativity and investigative, curious human Homo sapien minds. But how do we take all of that, who we are, the best of our species, and rejoin the pace of the evolutionary tree of life? How do we come back to the garden having eaten the fruit and be part of the tree of life again, instead of this strange thing hanging off the branches threatening to just take down the rest of the tree. Beautiful image from Richard Powers' The Overstory. And this is essentially his imagining of climate chaos and what comes on the other side. He says, "The fires will come despite all efforts, the blight and wind throw and floods. And then, and this is one of the many parts in the book where I started bawling, and then the earth will become another thing and people will learn it all over again." The earth will become another thing and people will learn it all over again. "The vaults of seed banks will be thrown open. Second growth, as opposed to old growth, second growth will rush back in, supple, loud, testing all possibilities. Webs of forest will swell with species shot through in shadow and dappled by new design." Remember that being a tree is something that is really great to do on Mother Earth. So I take great solace knowing that even as tree species go extinct in the long game, there will be trees. It's happened so many times before. "Each streak of color on the carpeted earth will rebuild its pollinators. Fish will surge again up all the watersheds, shacking themselves as thick as cordwood through the rivers, thousands per mile, once what we call the real world ends." And he has this beautiful image of this beautiful language of the world and this other world, that there's the world that we can't escape that we've made, the one of Zoom and meetings and clocks and human obligation to this industrial economy that is killing us. And then there's the world that we are killing through our devotion to that first world, and that we can come home to that other world. As a species, we will, whether we like it or not. It's a matter of how. And I want to end. This is Joanna Macy, but within a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer. Joanna Macy writes that until we can grieve for our planet, we cannot love it. Grieving is a sign of spiritual health. Grieving is a sign of spiritual health. But it's not enough to weep for our lost landscapes. We have to put our hands in the earth to make ourselves whole again. Even a wounded world is feeding us. Even a wounded world holds us, giving us moments of wonder and joy. I choose joy over despair. And so do I. And I bless you that you will find your way to that as well, even though the moments of grief are incredibly important. Grief is not the same as despair. And my personal journey into this work, which I certainly will not go into now, was absolutely through the gauntlet of grief. That the more I repressed it, the more paralyzed I was. And once I was able to grieve, a whole world of collaboration and creativity and possibility and belonging opened up to me. Thank you. That concludes the frontal part of my presentation. I would love to open it up for conversation, questions, comments. Maybe do, let's see, we'll do, you could, if you know how, you can use the raise hand function on Zoom or turn on your camera and actually just wave your hand, but there's two screens, so. Ken.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Shoshana, for this really thought-provoking presentation. I didn't hear one of the transformations of people once they pass the agricultural stage, unless I missed something.
Oh, you're right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Really? Yeah, sorry. You're absolutely right. So the three that I had in my brain were coming out of this place, Central Africa, the beginning of agriculture, and then the industrial age starting in the 18th century. That's just this acceleration. But but what was so important to me learning in high school was that contrary to what I thought as a kid, that actually so much of the destruction and the patterns of destruction we had as a species had already been in place long before the industrial age, which I think is, both upsetting, but also in a way comforting that we're not actually doing anything new. We're just doing it faster.
Right, and that's what I was thinking. You would say that the third exile was the industrial one. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sure.
So,
Adele, sorry, I was muted when I
Yeah.
called on you. I apologize. Please.
yeah, so you talked about, looking at the perspective beyond humanity as the process of what goes on the planet if when we're gone. And what I flashed on was how phenomenally exciting it was when, I don't know how many years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago, the physicists found gravitational waves. They were able to verify what Einstein knew, and just how it was that same feeling, but beyond the planet to the universe. And I just wanted to put that even bigger perspective out there.
Thank you. I love it. I love it. I'm really into, I think this is Reb Zalman Lav HaShalom's language, but the idea of God fields, Fields,
Yeah.
like there's different like senses of God, right? There's like the Israelite, and sometimes you get different God fields in different places. I think I'm quoting him correctly, but there's like a different zhuzh. And absolutely, I mean, I get a different one when I tune into to the God of Israel. It feels like different, not that it's a different God, but like a different feeling than when I tune into the whole planet. And outer space, like bigger than the planet, feels really different to me too. This is all in my imaginal spiritual zone, making no claims on metaphysical reality here. Thank you, Adele. Yeah. Yes, Rita, please.
Oh, I'm unmuted. Good. So I'm sorry I joined late. What this made me think of is the concept of rights of soil. I don't know if you've heard of this. This year's World Food Prize, for the first time, in past years it's often gone to, it was started by the notion of big ag, really industrial ag. But this year, Dr. Ratan Lal of Ohio State University, who's been a soil scientist for 50 years, got the prize. And one of the notions that he brought forward in an article just about a year and a half ago is that the rights of soil are even larger than humanity, that it's a planetary right, and that soil is a living creature, kind of is building on the rights of Pachamama, Mother Earth. So
Thank you.
Coming at this from another angle.
Thank you. Yes, and what I love thinking about, where was it that I was just, oh, The Atlantic recently had this great short article about why is it that like evolutionarily, why is it that humans drive ourselves crazy to get to achieve? Where does that come from? And part of the article goes into some anthropology that was done in a tribe that stayed completely separate, like totally isolated from the rest of human civilization until something like the 80s. And so anthropologists visited, and what they learned there was that it actually took work. It was there was conscious effort in their culture to squash pride and overachieving. And it took effort. And they had different ways of doing it, like insulting the person who would make a big kill, and praising the person who'd made the arrow that happened to be the arrow that slaughtered that animal. And what that showed me was, like, as a species, we are going to take up the space that we want to take up unless we put boundaries on ourselves. We have to be the ones to do that. And giving rights to soil or asserting the rights of rivers, like in New Zealand, is one way that we can speak human language. Like, what is rights? That's just something that we think of. That's not gravity. It's not a property of the universe, but we need those concepts to put limits on what our species will otherwise do, which is take up all the space we can, which, to be fair, is what most species would do. It's just we seem to do it because of these giant brains really fast. I love that of the rights. Thank you. Carrie.
Mostly, I just want to really say thank you so much for everything that you've been discussing. I'm an artist. I also studied anthropology as an undergrad many, many moons ago, but in my artwork, I work on a lot of the stuff you're talking about, and it's so interesting to me to hear someone having so many of the same thoughts. I love the overstory. I very much read into the Highology liturgy, not just the evolutionary stuff, but also the ephemeral stuff of when we talk about this passing shadow, or a lot of the ephemeral stuff, but connected to the deep time and the big picture. And anyway, this was great, and it was really food for thought, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Would you drop your website in the chat if there's a way that we can see your artwork?
Yes, except I don't see the chat function.
Can you not chat? Oh no, sorry. And I don't, well, let's see. That's very strange. You're right. I don't either. And I don't know how.
Usually it's better.
You should be able to find my email. Sorry about that. And I'm sorry that I didn't realize that earlier.
I'll look for your emails.
Yeah, you can, easy as Rabbi Shoshana Friedman at gmail.com. I'm also reachable just at rabbishoshana.com is my website, and there's a contact me there. I'm happy to then send it out. Sorry, it's so strange. Does anybody
Okay, I'm sure I can
really
find
how to turn on the chat function? Sorry, I'm on Hebrew College's Zoom. All right, other comments?
Teenager who probably knows
Thank you.
Shoshana's the host. Yeah.
Okay, so she would go into, I think there's a button somewhere on the bottom that's like privacy, or she could give you host.
Here, hold on, I'm gonna give you host, make co-host.
I can't hear her either.
Having teenagers helpful. Okay, she said she just made you co-host.
Oh, no, sorry, I made Adela co-host.
She made Adele co-host. Okay.
Hold on.
You can hear.
Wait, sorry, tell me what's your name on here?
I'm Carrie Kessler.
Sorry, Carrie, thank you. I went into like presentation freeze mode. Okay, all right, now you should be a host.
Okay.
While we're getting the chat going, I welcome any other comments, questions.
Here, mute us.
So I will, oh great, Jen, go ahead.
I just wanted to say hi, that was really beautiful. I'm from Temple Sinai.
Hi, Jen. It's great to see you.
That was really beautiful. And I love how you talk about Bereshit as not prescriptive, but descriptive. Really helps me with that passage, which is really troubling for me. That was Devon's bat mitzvah passage, and she is a scientist and a budding ecologist, also really struggled with that and what it means today. And I'm going to share this with her. She's doing homework right now, but they all wanted to say hi.
Thank you. So I want to say, because we're nearing 9 and it is late, and there's no need for us to stay on all the way till 9:15 if folks feel like we're done. But I do want to, before we close, just put a plug. So I work, first of all, to say thank you to the whole festival. This has been a labor of really grassroots love. of a couple of people working very, very hard, and then some of the rest of us working not quite as hard, but also hard, and a huge number of Jewish institutions who have stepped up to co-sponsor, and including Hillel International, the Bronfman Foundation, all of the major rabbinical schools and movements left of Orthodoxy. And I think that's amazing. I think we're in a watershed moment in terms of picking up the pace and the intensity and the meaning and the power building of Jews within the climate movement. And I want to really suggest that everybody check out Dayenu.org. That's Dayenu spelled the same way that you spell Dayenu at the Seder table. .org. And Dayenu is a Jewish call to climate action, and it's a wonderful power building climate organization that was just launched last spring, right in the beginning of COVID. And the units, sort of like Sunrise Movement, if you're familiar with Sunrise, where it's a national organization, but there's local organizing hubs. Dayenu has the scaffolding to create Dayenu circles, which are small groups of people. It could just be 3 people, it could be more, either individual, friends, family, or at a congregation or another Jewish organization, who come together to lend their power to the national climate campaigns Dayenu is working on, to get support from the central strategists at Dayenu, and to also work on local issues. In Massachusetts, there is What to Do Here. Baker vetoed a climate bill recently that drove me crazy. This is really exciting. And what a lot of the Jewish community for years, we have been focusing on greening our institutions and lowering our personal carbon footprints. And my language right now that I try to say to everybody is, that is great. That is spiritual practice. That is great, but it is spiritual practice at this point. That does not count as activism. If you feel called to get climate active as an activist in climate change, you got to get bigger than your institution or your personal choices, and work on the municipal, state, and national level around policy. Because we are, even if we all greened our institutions and every single choice in our lives, we're embedded in this system that is just destructive, that if we don't change the system, that personal stuff doesn't matter. So it matters. But I really think of it as spiritual practice, and I find that frame really useful and inviting. So check out Dayenu.org. Does anybody have any last comment that I have not left room for? Tomorrow I'll be leading a session from 12 p.m. to 1:15 on spiritual resilience for young children and climate change, and that oddly with the chat, but you can find that on the website. I want to thank each of you for staying up till 9 o'clock if you're on the East Coast to talk about trees and life and big time and climate change. And I bless you for your own personal journey to reconnect, bring your own knowledge and reconnect to the tree of life. Tu b'shvat sameach.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Rabbi Shoshana.
Thanks, Ken. Great to see you.
Likewise, really.
Thank you.
Thank you.